Shut up and sit down.
Hey, hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Middleism Eschatology, giving an apologetic for the hope of a futurist like me, second coming and a rapture. We are again here dealing with our good friend William Bell. This is part 4 of his videos that we are talking about, and we got to remember we've now done 3 other videos, and one of the other ones that we did, we talked about the futurist position on what is the second coming. And the rapture that's all involved with what is exactly where the rapture comes from, how is that idea developed through scriptures, and we showed you that the meaning of the word parousia is directly tied to Palm Sunday, and when Christ came back to Jerusalem, play on the words here, he sent word ahead, the city emptied up, and they met him on the road as he was coming in. And this is the type of parousia that we're talking about. This is very common in the Roman world. When a Caesar, a king, came to a city, he would announce to the king that to the city the king was coming, and they would pour out, meet him on the road, and then escort him in. So the same imagery is what's being used here in 1 Thessalonians 4, and we're talking about the coming of the Lord and us meeting him in the air. That word apontesis. And this is something that Don has already admitted and has been dealt with and talked about before with him, that he knows, and he's even definitely clarified and have said the same thing about that word, about meeting him. But William Bell's point here is that we who are alive are left caught up together in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. He wants to argue from Old Testament that any time that anybody met the Lord in the clouds, it always meant they came up to the mountain and the cloud would come down, and it was always a type of a theophany or some type of manifestation of God that was being there. And it, further noted point, it was always something physical, either a cloud or, as in Exodus 24, it is the Lord himself, the God of Israel, that appeared. So, and a theophany is an Old Testament appearing of God, and mostly of Christ, who shows up bodily, physically, and sits there and talks, and often is referred to as an angel of the Lord or the Lord. For example, with Abraham in Genesis 18, it was an angel of the Lord that he met there when he talked with him about Lot, and so forth. So that's what he wants to argue, is it's not really a coming down, meeting him in the air, because he redefines all of that language there and tries to apply it to that. But we've already discussed that. We've already talked about it, so we won't go over again. So without further ado, we're going to start right here, and we're going to start moving forward. Now this is Lord descends from heaven, 1 Thessalonians 4, part 6, and he's stating there is no rapture. So we're going to go through this a little bit and point out, again, several errors. And of course, I've thrown this out there to William Bell. Anybody, they want a debate, I'm more than willing to debate on it. William Bell doesn't usually engage in debates, it's obvious. I could say it's because he can't stand up to one, but that might not be a nice thing to say exactly. So we're going to be starting right here. I guess I'll make sure that we're on the right screen. I did that last time, did the whole thing without it. So we're in 1 Thessalonians 4 over here, and now we're going to begin with him. And we're all going to take it slowly. I understand that people are not wanting to watch half an hour, so I will try to keep these brief and to the point.
In connection with the Exodus, when the Lord came in that temple presence in the Exodus, it's saying here, the Lord my God will come and all the saints with you. Now, there is no doubt that in this particular context that we have what is generally considered to be the coming of the Lord, the return of Christ. As a matter of fact, I had a discussion with some Hebrew Israelites, the Sakari group, and they were arguing that this was the coming of the Lord. And of course, I acknowledge, yes, it is the coming of the Lord. It is the coming of the Lord in connection with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD, that it had to do with the battle against Jerusalem, which you can see in verse 2. He says, "For I will gather all nations to battle against Jerusalem." And some people you see examples of the president visit his people, rapture from the
I'm supposed to be 158. I went too far
this
ahead
2,000
for
years
some reason.
millennial reign. At some point in time, we'll get into a more specific discussion of that. But for today, we're going to continue in looking at some of the symbolism that we find in the chapter on 1 Thessalonians. We've been comparing that with several passages in the Old Testament. Of course, the Exodus, which was an appearance of God, what you might say was a theophany in terms of God coming down, making himself known.
But he's not telling you a theophany is a physical bodily appearance of an angel receiving food, or from Abraham. And for example, there was a physicality to it. In Exodus 24, as I pointed out, when they ate and drank with him, he ate and drank with them. And that would be part of a covenant ritual that you shared and broke bread together to solidify the covenant that you just made, and it was part of it. So Jesus being part of that, God being part of it, he would have had to eat, and he appeared there physically bodily. But William Bill won't tell you that.
And this is sort of the idea when God comes down to man. And so we're showing that by looking at that example and others similar to it, that is what we have in 1 Thessalonians chapter.
And that's completely dead wrong, because unlike the Father, Jesus himself is what? Came in the flesh. He became flesh. So in that incarnation, Jesus is a person who is being God being manifested and being seen before all people. We know that he ascended in that same self-body. There's no scripture that says he got rid of his body. The scripture also talks that he, once he's raised, that he is no longer subject to death, and they're talking about that physical death. He's no longer subject to physical death any further. And so at this coming, the coming of the Lord, the second coming, the parousia, the Lord himself will descend from heaven. And this is in conjunction with Acts 1, where it says, "This Jesus that you saw go up will be the same one you will see come down." And then also in 1 John chapter 3, this Jesus who is coming, he will be revealed from heaven, and be revealed what we will be, and we shall see him as he is. That's a very clear statement that John is saying that when Jesus comes back, every eye will see him. We shall see him when he comes. That's also strengthened in Hebrews 8:28. He appeared the first time to deal with sin. He will appear a second time. So the second appearing has to be the same type of appearing when he first comes and his second coming then. And of course, in a premillennial view, his second coming is about him establishing his kingdom in Jerusalem on this earth in the coming of the physical kingdom. Lord, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And it's the Lord ruling on the earth. And that also is confirmed in Acts 1 when they asked him, "Lord, at this time will you restore the kingdom to Israel?" See, Jesus being the son of David, the promise was that he would sit on David's throne. Well, David's throne is not in heaven. David's throne is over the physical kingdom here on earth. And so when Jesus returns, he's going to sit on that throne over a united Israel. All right, let's move on.
4, it is God coming down to visit his people. The idea of a tabernacle presence of God, and many of the attendant events and occurrences that surrounded God's presence, such as clouds, thunder, lightning, etc. All of those things just typify the presence of God.
But in every case where God came down, where he filled up the temple, when Josh was hung around out there, in one passage there, it talks about Joshua hanging around. What a man. But it always was a physical thing that people saw. They always saw these physical manifestations of the clouds. Every time you have talking about those clouds and lightnings and peals of thunder, those all happen on top of the mountain. And they're all things that they saw. They were not spiritual. They were not metaphorical. They were literal lightnings and thunders and everything else. I could go find it, but I'm not. I'll let you look it up.
And in his tabernacle presence, in his temple presence, in coming to be with man. And so when we look at 1 Thessalonians, we shouldn't take it from the idea of a literalistic view that and traditional view that many people.
You see that traditional view. Do not take the traditional view, which means this is what the church has taught for 2,000 years. You guys need to ignore that. You need to listen to me because I know better than Thomas Aquinas, Luther, Calvin. I know better. Us 5 or 6 here, full preterists, we know better. We even understand the scriptures better than all they have ever done in the past. For 2,000 years, nobody's ever taught the full preterist position that all prophecy was fulfilled in 70. Nobody's done it except these guys, and they still want you to believe that they're the ones who got it right. Everybody else has got it wrong. And that's the first sign of a cult. And deception.
Used to speak of those events, but rather to speak of it from the perspective of biblical things. And
see, he said traditional, but we're doing it from biblical. Well, if he understood biblical theology that has been taught for 2,000 years, which he hasn't studied, he doesn't know, he would know how those things were developed biblically.
Comparing the scriptures with scripture, allowing scripture to interpret scripture.
You see that basis right there. Okay, let me take you to something, and I'll show you why they do not listen. And this is something that's been thrown in my face. They do not listen to that and pay attention. They give lip service to it, and I'll show you why. Matthew 5:18. Further, I say to you, heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass away from the law until all is accomplished. Now, if we were to look this passage up, where would the other passage cross-references be? Here it is. Luke 16:7. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for a single stroke of a pen to drop out of the law. You've got to understand, Matthew wrote to a Jewish audience, so he would use Jewish idioms. He would not explain that because they would understand it. Luke is writing to a Greek audience, to Greek people who wouldn't understand those things. So he explains more thoroughly for us. It would be more clear for us who are not Jews to understand what he's saying. So it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for a single stroke of pen. That's a Hebrew idiom. It's easier for hell to freeze over than for pigs fly before this happens. That's the exact same type of expression that's being used here. So verily saying to you, English, for I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. It sounds similar. It seems like it has different, but it's jot and pen, stroke of the pen. We're talking about the little tiniest dot, the littlest letter of the Greek languages, or the Hebrew language, iota, iota. It is the I, it's just a little dash mark. And he's saying all of the promises, everything that was made in that covenant with the promise between Abraham must be fulfilled. And if it must be fulfilled, then that means the terms and the conditions of that covenant had to be completed. You cannot change those terms or conditions until the covenant is completely fulfilled, until God's promises all were kept. He cannot violate any of those promises. He cannot violate any of those covenants. Terms of the covenant, they all had to be completely met, and it was all met in Jesus. That's the basic argument on that point. But so when he claims to do that, no, they don't. They don't. They don't adhere to that. Let me show you one other one. So what prophecy was to be fulfilled? All prophecies, or what? I'll show you what Luke says in the last chapter here. Luke 24. You'll get this. This is just as pure, easy as anything else. Then he said to them, these are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. What is Matthew? Let's see if we got that short link in there too. It goes back to Matthew. all this took place to fulfill what the Lord said through the prophets. I don't think in this thing it goes back to that Matthew passage. But again, that is the point. Everything that was written about him is what? To be fulfilled. Not every prophecy, but every prophecy concerning Christ about him that was written in the law, the Psalms and prophets. So, see, they give lip service to the idea, let Scripture interpret Scripture, but it is simply not true. Not true whatsoever. I'm going to leave that at the bottom point, and we'll move on from there in our next video. But again, I want you to understand, they give lip service, and this is what we're going to be doing, is dealing with him. So, let me take a look at something. I do not think, I have no idea about time and everything else, so I might be cutting this a little bit short, but I want you to dwell on that and to think about that and deal with that, and we'll continue on with the next one. We'll keep it short and simple.